Okay, so we're now recording and my screen should be on show. Gary, I might just, are you having difficulty being online? Okay, I'm going to come back to questions. I'm just going to have to pause I'll pause sort of partway through at the end of each slide. Okay, so just in the sense of well, just in terms of outline of what we're going to cover tonight, this webinar really came from on the back of a lot of discussions that we're having with people, particularly I think as we've progressed through the 30th of June, end of the financial year, and people are starting to ask and set goals and ask the question during the coaching calls, what do we think of some of the financial goals? And I think, and jump in anytime, Gary, but I think from the outset, what we need to make clear is that the financial results, there's a couple of things about financial results. The first one is I don't think they're particularly highly motivating for the rest of the team. That's the first thing. And in fact, in some instances, I think they can be quite demotivating. And the second important thing is that they really are the result of certain activities. So if we can think about financial numbers as being less around being a goal and more around being a result, and then from that, establishing that financial goal or that financial target, then we need to build around that a strategy in order to achieve it. So, for example, if you said you wanted to increase revenue by 20%, the first question that you would have to ask is, what are you doing with profit? Because increasing revenue by 20% automatically means that you have a greater dilutionary effect on the fixed cost component of the business. So you should be able to achieve an incremental increase in margin that is proportionally higher the more you increase your revenue. And hopefully that makes sense to everybody. And so when we start to think about some of these things, it's around what are those things that's going to drive revenue, but at the same time keep a focus on profit, so that this just doesn't become an exercise in increasing revenue and actually not increase profits at all. In other words, you're gearing the business up through either some sort of debt or equity component that actually is involved in that revenue increase, because you have to spend a bit of money to generate the revenue, but in actual fact, you're not actually increasing your profit. And so in this goal-setting time that we're in right now, which is that sort of post-30 June, we've seen the numbers come out of last year and want to sort of revisit things. Let's just keep those two factors in mind, that firstly, financial targets don't necessarily motivate people, certainly not all people. In fact, they can have quite a polarizing effect. And secondly, they are, sorry, Gary, what was my second point? First point is that they polarize. Second one is they're not a goal, they're actually a target. And in fact, we need to build goals around them to end up with them as a result, with those financial targets as a result. So this presentation is really divided into four main sections, and I'll just quickly cover those now. First one is what to measure. And again, this is being recorded, and you'll be able to get a copy of this. We'll post this as well as the slide deck. What to measure, how to establish financial targets, what to think about in terms of a financial dashboard, and selling your practice, and some issues there around strategic valuations of the practice. So let's just dive into it. Okay, what to measure? The first thing to do is to make sure that we're matching expenses against revenue. And so the reason why we do that, and the reason why a P&L is structured in the way it is that if we are buying a whole load of drugs in June and not selling those drugs until July, August, September, and then finally maybe we sell the last of them in October before we have another big round of expenditure in November on drugs, that ultimately has the cash flow associated with that and the P&L treatment of those drugs needs to be treated differently. The reason why the P&L needs to match the expenditure with the sale is so that you can compare one season on another. So, for example, if you sold a whole load of drugs in September, then those drugs are sold at a margin, obviously, because it costs money to buy those drugs in the first place, and you need to match those expenses with the revenue that's received in September. P&L is a wonderful tool as long as it's used accurately to match expenditure and revenue in the same period. Now, most people use a P&L on a monthly period, and so use the month as the period. Some organisations actually use 13 periods a year, a period being 4 weeks. So 13 times 4 is 52 weeks. Aldi, for example, a German supermarket, don't talk in months, they talk in periods. And so everybody knows what period you're on, whether it's 1 through to 13. But whatever the period is, the important part of a P&L is to make sure that you're matching your expenditure with the revenue so that you can compare like with like. And sometimes the discussion will be, revenue is down or profits are down in August on July, or in September on the August number. So on a month-on-month basis, I think that has less relevance. So the first question that comes to my mind is that if you're talking about what does September's revenue look like, I'm less interested in August and more interested in September 2014 and September 2013 to establish a pattern. And you might take it on a quarter, you might compare Q1, FY Q1, which is to the end of September, so July, August, and September, or FY Q2, which is to 31 December, and then compare those quarters with prior quarters of the same period. So that's called seasonally adjusted numbers. So if you don't seasonally adjust your figures, then there's no real point in comparing September with August. It's obviously it has some value, but not a lot. And then comparing September 15 on September 14 is probably not as robust as September 15 on 14 on 13. So you're getting 3 years worth of numbers. So that's just the important part about matching expenses against revenue so that you're really clear on what it looks like. Now, obviously, cash flow is a totally different story. Your cash flow is going to take a massive dive in July when you go out and buy all the drugs, and then you're going to be collecting the revenue through August, September, October before you go and spend more money on drugs in November. So treat cash flow and P&L as two separate things. For some of you, I'm sorry, this may appear really basic. So we're just sort of pitching at a mid-level, and maybe towards the end there'll be some stuff there that might be more relevant. After salary profit, measure your profitability after you've paid yourself. If ever you're looking at any business, whether it be for sale or whether it just be for what it's doing, some people say that you shouldn't run a business to buy a salary. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think if you're running a business and it gives you the autonomy and perhaps the purpose and or mastery that you need, and we know from the Lincoln training that those three things are three of the biggest motivators that exist. If you're running a business that achieves a good salary for you and actually doesn't make much profit at all, then I'm not convinced that's such a bad thing. I'd need convincing of that, and I'd be open to a dialogue on that. But I just think if you can pull a good salary out of a business and it doesn't necessarily have a lot of retained earnings at the end of the year or retained profits, then that's, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But I do think it is important to at least match that up against a salary that anyone else would need to draw from the business in order to be able to run the same business. So let's say, for example, you're pulling a couple of $100,000 in salary out of your clinic, and in actual fact, you could probably do it for $120,000 with someone else in there. It's just important to bear in mind that the profit from that practice is actually $80,000. It's not $200,000, and it can be misleading. Having said that, if you were to sell your business, sell the practice to somebody else, and you were paying, for example, a practice manager, and a corporate was to come in, they may add back that practice manager's salary into the profitability of the business because they don't need one. They've got one that might, for example, manage 3 or 4 practices at once. This is the leverage that comes from multiple practices. Is that they would say, well, you're paying a practice manager, say, I don't know, correct me here, Gary, but $70,000 or $80,000 you're paying your practice manager.
Yeah, no, that would be fine.
Yeah, and you've got
probably high-ish, in fact, in our market.
What? Sorry, that's high-ish. Did you say?
Possibly, yeah. Yeah, but it would vary greatly from the hours worked and where they were.
So if I was a corporate and I was coming in to buy your practice, I might add that salary back in and say I don't need it. So that practice manager will go as a result of the restructure and the purchase. And in actual fact, so that $80,000 goes straight back onto your bottom line. So the way we treat salaries just needs to be carefully thought through. The way in terms of the way we think about our business, not only from a negative point of view, but also in that instance a positive point of view. It can actually be added back if you don't need too many practice managers. If you've posted a question, just hang in there. I'm just going to go through this slide, then I'll come to questions. Understanding margins is important. And the reason why is because if you just go out flat out and increase revenue and it doesn't actually increase profit, the likelihood is that your gross profit will go up, because gross profit is the total revenue less the cost of any goods to achieve that revenue. And so I'm not going to attempt to run through any specific numbers here. That they would be numbers that you could pull from an industry benchmarking point of view. But if you've got $100,000 in gross profit and you're spending $20,000 to achieve that sale through the actual goods that you're selling, so primarily drugs, then you've got an 80% gross margin. Your EBIT is your earnings before interest and tax. The reason why EBIT is an important margin is because it takes out your operating expenses and it doesn't factor in interest and tax. And the reason why it doesn't is because interest is associated with how you've chosen to fund your business. If you fund it with cash, you don't have any interest. If you funded it with debt, you have interest. Cash, of course, is your own cash, or it could be equity from other people, like shareholders coming in. And so, excuse me, if you have an interest and tax component in there, and I was coming in to buy your business, my EBIT might be different because, my net profit after tax might be different to yours. So if we just stop at the EBIT point, then at least I can deal with my own tax situation. I can deal with my own funding, cost of funding. And then NPAT is net profit after tax. Net profit after tax obviously is as it describes, and it also factors in interest as well, interest on any debt funding. And so understanding those three margins is important. Probably EBIT is the one that we most focus on, and you can increase your revenue, maintain a fairly consistent gross margin as a result of increasing that revenue, because it's just. But you may do it, for example, with less drugs. So you might increase your surgery, for example. Probably a bad example there, Gary, but because you need more drugs, the more surgery you do. But there would be stuff activity you would do in the clinic that would generate revenue that wouldn't necessarily cost. There would be no goods associated with that, so that might increase your gross margin.
Yeah, in fact, that's quite true with a lot of our professional services. We could grow revenue in those professional services areas far greater than the amount of goods, drugs and disposables that we need to match that.
And obviously you can increase your gross margin by reducing your costs. So for every percentage point you reduce your cost of drugs, that has a 100% impact on your gross margin. I'm going to come to this a bit later on about what you tackle, whether you tackle costs or revenue and the impact of those. Okay, industry benchmarking. This relates to, I think, Gary, the industry average is about 5 times the salary is what you should be generating from a vet in terms of revenue.
That's generally the accepted number, yeah.
So, I think those benchmarks can be quite helpful because they allow you to sit back and say, well, how am I, am I wildly off target, or am I, sort of operating within a range that's acceptable. The other one there that's worth having a look at is retail space. I think this opens up a whole different conversation around, the potential impact of online sales, and I think one of the guys in Team Charlie, New South Wales, a couple of weeks ago, he was sort of less concerned about that. I think that was Mark. He was sort of less. He'd sort of done some research on it and was indicating that online sales may or may not have such a big impact, but that's probably beyond the scope of this. It's really around how do we deal with retail space and how are we making best utilisation of the space that we have. And so if I put on my old Aldi director hat, I'd be going, how much square meterage have we got in terms of retail space, and how can we optimize that space better? So what are we selling now from the total square meters that has been used by that? And I think that's a good number to at least get your head around from a big picture perspective. There may not be much movement in it. It may not be that sensitive a number, but I would suspect that if you've got a large space that could be converted, for example, into a consult room, or not necessarily a treatment room, but certainly a consult room, would that be a better utilisation of the space? Or maybe you've got a couple of other rooms that aren't really doing much, and could that be used for retail? We looked at. I was in a clinic the other day, and we talked about they got a big garage at the back, and where you can actually get car access. And the conversation was, would it be worthwhile moving some of the heavier stuff from the shop floor and putting it out the back there, and just reducing some of the clutter on the shop floor? So I'm not really talking about that, because that's just aesthetics. I'm talking about the actual usage of the space, and could it be better utilised? Supermarkets go to a huge amount of trouble to make sure that their end caps are the primary end caps. They make them market specific. In fact, I was talking to a Coles supermarket operator the other day who was telling me that he's up at Townsville. He has an end cap which is for the infantry soldiers that come in. There's a whole bunch of things that are on that end cap that generate a lot more sales per square foot as a result of just applying a little bit of science as to what the market actually wants in that local area. And those guys, there's torches, batteries, cigarette lighters. It's just all that gumph that you'd normally have to walk up and down every aisle to try and find. They just stick them all on that one end cap and make it dedicated to soldiers. No, I'm not sure how relevant that is to you guys, but it's certainly worth thinking about. We talked already a little bit about seasonal adjustments, and just making sure that if you are comparing your sales for September, for example, you compare them with like periods from previous years, and try and get some sort of trend analysis going as to what September typically looks like. This is why matching is so important, because if you throw in paying a drug bill for $30,000 into September, which is really a cash flow issue, it's nothing to do with P&L. If you throw that in and all of a sudden your P&L is wiped out by $30,000 in September, you'll think you've had a terrible month. In actual fact, all you've done is you should be accruing those expenses over the next 3 months whilst you sell that product, and then expensing it throughout those subsequent months. Okay, let's just go into questions. I'm just going to have to, it doesn't allow me to do this without actually escaping out of the screen. So let me just go into here, just have a quick look.
There's one there from Steve. When benchmarking, are we talking invoices generated?
But by vets, including.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, can you hear me? Yep.
Yeah. So I think with that one there, I think it would be excluding GST. Part of the reason why I say that is because that was a figure that was well accepted. In fact, I think before GST even existed. But what we can do, we can confirm that, and with a follow-up email to let everybody know. I'm fairly certain that's ex-GST, but we'll follow that one up and let everyone know.
Okay, thanks, Gary. That's the only questions, which is, I think it is. Quick scroll in. Yep, thanks, Steve. Alrighty, let's have a look at the next one, establishing financial targets and building a strategy around these. We've already mentioned staff are probably not that interested in financial targets. And they may well be actually quite demotivating. And your strategy, however, to hit those targets becomes the basis for the practice goals. So let's just think about that for a second. If you said that you wanted to, and I think this is where the homework needs to take place for the practice owners. If you're sitting on a Sunday planning out your year, and you go, I want to increase our profitability by 20%. So we currently did 10%, we want to get to 12. That's, if you say you're going to increase profitability by 20%, and you did 10 last year, I would say that means you're going to get to 12%. So then you say, all right, in order to get to 12%, what do I need to do on the revenue side? And obviously there are some things that are going to be more profitable than others. There are some that are going to have more of you're going to be able to get quick wins, and other areas you're probably going to have a little bit of capital expenditure, so a little bit of balance sheet activity where you might have to throw some cash at something like some more equipment. to eventually then yield a profit. And so,
Paul, Paul, it might also be based in part on recognising where the practice is performing and where the opportunities lie. So by looking particularly, and that's again value of benchmarking figures, if we know that, for example, a great dental practice will produce about 10 or 11% of its gross turnover through dentistry, and we're presently at 3 or 4%, then it makes great sense to be focusing in that area because there's so much opportunity to achieve probably fairly rapid results.
And, depending on your demographic and a whole range of things. But I think the important part is that once you've worked out where you think the best place to target is, and I would really strongly encourage you to pick up the phone and contact your teammates within Lincoln, because it is the best source of knowledge. There are other programs running around out there now, which I think are good as well, that are reasonably costly, that allow you to sort of bring in external parties, and those people that are operating within a team, just leverage those teammates, and you're not competing with them. We've set the teams up so that's not the case, and I think it'd be really disappointing if you get to the end of a year and not a single outbound phone call to say, what's the most profitable aspect of your business? What's your number one lesson learned over the last 12 months of a rollout of dentistry, or something along those lines, and really create a supporting network to come up with ideas. And I haven't met many people yet that aren't happy to share ways in which they've found success, particularly if they're not competing. But once you've worked out what those targets need to be, and it might be in order to achieve a 20% increase in profitability, you need to increase your turnover by whatever number. That's when you sit down and say, right, let's now establish some practice goals. So just following on Gary's thoughts a moment ago, the practice goal then becomes to introduce dentistry. And so when we sit down to talk with our team, we say, righto, the plan is to introduce dentistry, and what we want to get to is 10 dentals a week, or whatever the number is, over a certain time frame. And then, as we teach at Lincoln, try and get that out of the team, how to do that. So tell them what needs to happen, and then sit down, and you might even coach through that and say, what do we think is achievable? But hopefully you've done your numbers and you've done your homework so that you've built that figure of how many new dentals do you need to do around your targeted financial figure. Now, no one in the practice needs to know how much profit that generates necessarily. Some of you might want to share that, but they certainly need to know, well, if we're going to target 10 in order to grow the business to the level we need to, then we need to do 10 dentals a week. How are we going to get to 10 dentals a week? And first of all, is that achievable? And ask the team, ask the guys if they think that's achievable, and then build a plan around the growth of that. And all of your practice goals can then be geared around those particular activities that you've identified, or that the team identifies, are part of the strategy to grow revenue and grow profitability to a certain level. And as long as you've done the numbers and done the science on it and done all the background checks to know what 10 dentals will actually produce, and you know that 10 dentals is not completely ridiculous given your demographic and where you're at, then that should be able to provide you with a relatively nice, easy conversation with the team to say, this is where we need to get to. I'm not sure how to get there. I'm looking for your input. What do you think we need to do? What sort of time frame? How quickly can we get this cranking? And then transfer ownership back to them at that point. To come in and say, I want to do 10 dentals because 10 dentals sounds like a right idea, but not know what that means in terms of your ultimate financial target, I think is probably fraught with danger. So get clear on your numbers first, and then build the strategy around it, and then turn that strategy into the team's goals. Okay, good. I can see there's no more questions coming. Sorry, Gary.
Sorry, Paul. Just one other point that I find often valuable there, in terms of when we start to talk about the why to introduce goals, and even though, like you're saying, for me, behind that may well be a financially driven target, is to introduce the values, and that's why we spend a lot of time getting these core or shared values bedded down within the practice as well, because it makes that conversation around why we're doing this even easier. You know, if our values are around, you know, outstanding medicine and excellent service to our clients and those sorts of things, then of course we've got that instant alignment when we want to actually do better for our patients and ultimately better for our clients. It's totally in keeping with all the values that we've agreed upon in the first place.
Great. Yep. Totally agree. Alrighty. Let's have a look at what it means to maintain a dashboard. Measuring the numbers or staying on top of the key numbers is important in any business, but I think it is important not to have too many unless the system you have is really sophisticated. This is not an ad for Anne and Paolo because I haven't even seen their system, but I know that their system, I can imagine what their system is like. I'd imagine it's very powerful, and I think with guys like that, ex-vets, now accountants, sitting behind driving the figures, I think that's not fraught with danger. I think that's probably a good thing because I think the devil is in the detail with the figures. But I think my preference would be to go much simpler than that. I'll give you an example. Back at Aldi, when we were doing financial feasibilities for buying a supermarket site, that was my job to pull that together, and we had one internal rate of return. An internal rate of return, without getting too complicated, is basically how much money are the Germans getting for their cash invested. But an internal rate of return is time sensitive, which obviously it needs to be. That report used to be 2 pages. I visited Aldi recently and met one of the managing directors who used to be a director with me years and years ago. We went outside and we were just sort of reliving old times. He pulled out a folder. The folder is now about 3 inches thick of the stuff that they now measure, and I'm not convinced it adds a lot more value. I obviously didn't say anything, but that's just, and their systems have obviously become a lot more sophisticated because they can measure a lot more because they have 300 odd supermarkets, and in those days we didn't have any. But I think it does make you wonder how much we need to be actually measuring in terms of what the value is. I would say if it's not adding value, get rid of it because it's just a distraction. The only thing that I think is important is that one thing that's very important is that if you can achieve a single percentage saving in costs, that goes directly to your bottom line. So if you're doing 14% profit and you can EBIT and you can save 1% in costs, you'll go to 16% EBIT because that has a 100% one-to-one ratio impact on your bottom line. However, a 1% increase in revenue growth will only have an EBIT margin impact. So for every $100 that you manage to increase revenue, if you're only making 10% profit, you'll only add $10 to your bottom line. Now, the reason why that's important is because Aldi have a saying, and that is that you count the cents to save the dollars. And they live by it. There's lots of stories. I remember once getting a phone bill, $700. I had 34 sites under construction and development and spent most of my time in the car. My phone bill for a month was $700, and I got pulled up to the managing director to say, Paul, is there any way we can get this phone bill down? And I remember looking at him just completely baffled. I didn't even have a computer, so it wasn't like I was running a heavy IT bill. And the only thing I had to replace was the batteries in my calculator on a regular basis, and I was still getting pulled up, and it was reflective of the culture that existed there, and I think that's probably a good thing if you can count the cents to save the dollars, but just be mindful that for every cent you can shave off in costs, you'll save a cent, you'll increase a cent in terms of your profitability, and that's a really powerful thing to remember. Constantly look for those savings that can be achieved. It is a lot easier to find 2 or 3% in costs than it is to find 30% in revenue when you're operating at a 10% EBIT margin, because it's exactly the same bottom line impact. And so if you can find those savings, that's obviously a good thing. And that can sometimes mean that you're shopping around. And obviously you've got to weigh that against the cost of having to set it all up and change suppliers and all of those things. But don't be afraid to ask the question. If you don't ask, you won't get. No question. There's no doubt about that. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that one, Gary?
I guess the thing to be mindful, of course, in veterinary practice is that we have two operating costs far and above everything else, and therefore the ones to watch most closely, of course, biggest being wages and second being cost of goods sold. So they're the ones that have such a huge impact on our EBIT result at the end of the day. And therefore the ones that if we can make that saving, we're going to get the biggest results.
Mm. Yeah, I had a conversation today with a practice who obviously will remain nameless, and we were just talking about bonuses and performance-based pay. And I think this is a really interesting one. Look, I'm going to throw it. We've got a bit of time, because we're moving through quite quickly. I'm just going to throw this one in here as a little bit of a. This is a bit of a bonus, Gary. I hope it's okay. We're just going off. We're going off slide.
Yeah, sure.
Off slide for a second. Excuse me. And this was around. We're at a time now where we're thinking about remuneration, and everyone's thinking, oh well, we've gone past 30 June. Maybe we're going to get paid a little bit of a bonus or paid an increase in pay. We're also at a time when people are thinking about doing their IDRs, hopefully through Ulysses, but not necessarily. Some are still sort of onboarding. But when you're doing a development review with somebody, it is really, really important to separate remuneration discussions from development reviews. And the reason why it's important is because we don't want to use pay as a stick when it comes to improving performance. We don't want to have pay anywhere near it. And unfortunately, what tends to happen is we say, oh, look, you've performed quite well this year, so we're going to give you a bonus. And we know that they do not motivate people in the long run. They do for very mechanical tasks, but for non-mechanical, more technical and sophisticated work, they are not a motivator. In fact, they're a demotivator. And there is example after example after example of performance-based pay. So that is, you earn 50 grand, you get a $1,000 bonus if you achieve a certain result. That they're fraught with danger and they need to be managed extremely carefully. And certainly, if you're going to do a performance review or a development review, don't line it up with the REM review. So REM reviews are important. Everybody wants to know that they're at least growing by CPI, the Consumer Price Index, whatever that is. It's 2.5%. That we need to be growing, otherwise, in real terms, going backwards in terms of our pay. So that isn't important. So REM review needs to take place, no question about that. But I think REM reviews need to take place within the context of what is the industry paying. And you can't compare a country practice with a city practice because the cost of living in a city is much higher. So what is a like practice benchmark salary for a 3-year vet? That needs to be brought into the discussion, and those figures I'm sure are available. And what is the performance of the practice? Has the practice made any money? And I think for the owners of the practice, it's really, really important to sit back and say, what is my return on equity? How much money do I have invested in this practice? Let's say it's $1 million that's tied up. And the reason why it's $1 million tied up is because you could sell it and you could put $1 million in the bank. So if there's $1 million worth of equity tied up in a business, you want to be pulling a reasonable percentage of that, let's say 10%, so that's your return on equity. So you need to be pulling out $100,000 franked, which means that the tax has been paid by the company before you get it. So on the highest tax bracket, company would pay 30%, you'd pay the other 18%. I think company tax rates have just recently gone down. But fully franked just means basically you've only got to pay the top-up tax or the marginal tax increase over and above the cash that you get from the business. So that's let's say that's 10% return on equity. That's $100,000 a year, and then you also want to get your salary on top of that. And so, if I was running a practice that had $1 million in profit, I'd do two things. The first thing is I'd do a number of things. The first thing I'd say is let's do a REM review for everybody to CPI, and let's also do a benchmarking exercise and make sure that everybody is being paid in accordance with whatever the standard pay rates are now. You might even increase it by 10 or 15% to give you that sort of X factor as a practice to make sure that yours is the practice people want to stay at. Then I would look at how much equity I had tied up in the business, and I'd say, well, I need a return on that equity, so I'd pay myself that. And then I'd look at how much money we want to leave as retained earnings on the balance sheet. So what that means is that if you've made $1 million and you want to leave 3 or 4 months cash flow in the bank, so you've always got that up your sleeve, it's not a bad idea. I'm not sure what the number is, but 3 or 4 months would make sense to me. Maybe it's 6, but your accountant could tell you that. And that's going to leave some money left over at the end of the day that is either going to be paid out to shareholders, which might only be you and your partner, or it might just be you. And then take a percentage of that, and you might like to pay, say, 5% of that in proportion with everybody's salary as a share of the owner's excess profits as a result of a great bumper year. And they're secret. You're not allowed to discuss your bonuses. You make that clear with people. And in some organisations, it's a sackable offence if you talk about your bonuses because it has such a big morale impact. But then you just distribute that 5% of, let's say, $500,000. So 10% is 50. So $25,000 is going to be distributed across the practice, and it's going to be done in proportion with whatever. So it's not a bonus. Well, it is, but it is not related to an individual's performance. It's related purely to the practice's success over the period. So but the most important part, so however you structure all of that, the most important part is to keep that separate from their development review, so that under no circumstances can they sit there and say, can they sit there and link their development review and what you say about their past performance and what you agree needs to be set going forward, can they link that to their remuneration? The two should be completely disconnected. Google, type into Google REM review, remuneration review, and performance review, and put comma Harvard. There's a good article actually from Harvard. I tried sharing it today, but I lost my internet connection because I was traveling. But if you just Google remuneration, it'll just give you all the lowdown on what you need in terms of understanding that and getting it clear in your own mind. But make sure you separate the two. Always good idea to do the REM review first. So that's post 30 June. You know how you've gone financially as a business. You can look at the benchmark figures for what it costs to hire a vet or a nurse at a certain level, and you know what the CPI results are. So you can, 2 weeks into July, you can sit there and you can say, right, it's REM review time, here's your pay, this is your new pay, and in August, September, we'll be conducting our development reviews. And then during that discussion, the pay that you can raise, or they can take the opportunity to raise their REM review. If you do it the other way round and you do the development review first, that's their opportunity to say, by the way, what's my pay increase going to be? And at the same time, they're looking at what you say in that development review, and they're going to tie that to what you pay them. And you don't want that to happen. Okay, sorry, we're back online now. That was just a little off slide or off balance sheet conversation. So that was a pathetic finance joke.
Paul, I think that's a really valuable one though, because I think often we, particularly with veterinary staff, and a lot of practice owners I know from coaching calls, or practice owners really struggle to have anything scientific behind how they do remunerate them. It's been another 6 months, we'll pop it up a bit further, as opposed to having some kind of system like you've described, to put some science around it.
And maybe you could speak to your accountant and say, what's the CPI? What is the difference in cost of living between city and, how do I adjust the basket size? It'd be a percentage between rural and city. And get those hard figures so that you can actually set really clear expectations for people, and then have your round of remuneration meetings. You need a REM committee, I would suggest. Every organisation has a REM committee. It might just be you and the practice manager, but you should form a REM committee, a remuneration committee, and that REM's committee's responsibility is to make sure that they have a really clear understanding of exactly what remuneration structures should look like. And obviously, Gary and I and Chris can pick this up in the coaching as well. So don't if you're not getting it down now, you're concerned about it. This is an easy one for us to sort of follow up in on the coaching, but we'll follow up on. But form a REM committee, have a REM. Yeah, go ahead, Gary.
Sorry, there was just one other thing to mention too in establishing levels with a veterinarian. And support staff for that matter. VetLink do perform an anonymous survey annually to look at where our profession is at nationally, and for everyone who participates, they do provide those results back to you as well within a couple of months. So it can give you a really good indicator of across the nation where are salaries sitting for the various position descriptions and experience levels within the profession.
Great. Is that VetLink, is it, Gary?
That's VetLink, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And in fact, that just arrived in my inbox the other day. So if that's something you were involved in that you wanted to be, that would be worth just giving them a quick call and asking to be involved. I'm sure the more numbers they have, the more they feel they've got validity around or credibility around their numbers. So I'm sure that wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah. Okay. Good. And so, any more questions on that? Just post them on the thing, and we'll chat. We've got about 15 minutes left. I just want to spend that time. Maybe the last 5 minutes we can cover off any questions or leave some room at the end for questions. But in this next 10 minutes, let's just talk about what a strategic valuation means. And I think whether you're positioning your practice for sale, whether you're positioning your practice for a refinance, you might be wanting to switch equity for debt. In other words, you might have a shareholder that's a bit older and wants to move on. You can't afford to buy them out, so you're going to have to get some debt in to buy them out. Or it may be that you simply want to start planning now for your 5-year exit. Then an understanding of how strategic valuation works is really important. Now, there's a very good book written by Tom McCaskill. Tom, obviously Tom, and McCaskill is I think it's M-A-C, Caskills, A-S-K-I-L-L, I think. I'll Google it at the end and just let you know. So Tom McCaskill, and it's one of the best books I've ever read in terms of company valuations, and I think the same applies. But anyway, look, I can also talk to you about it as well, so it'd save you reading it. But let's first of all talk about what is a multiple on earnings. So there's a lot of talk about people going around town and saying paying 4 or 5 times multiple on earnings for your practice. So first of all, it's the EBIT. That's the number they're looking at. They're not looking at the NPAT, or they shouldn't be, because the NPAT, as I said earlier, contemplates funding through the interest component and tax, and of course both are very different depending on who the purchaser is. And it's a multiple on that EBIT figure. So if you're making $200,000 in profit at the end of 1 year, and you get a 4 times that, and they're offered 4 times, that means you'll get a check for $800,000. And then what that means is that the purchaser who's paid $800,000 will get their money back in 4 years, $200,000 each year. And obviously they're taking a bet that they can use their big marketing arm and their purchasing power for drugs and things like that. They actually think that they can get that back down again. So when they're paying you 4 times, they're probably actually really only paying you about 3.5 times, because they'll get their money back in 3.5 years, not 4 years, because they'll improve things. They might, for example, as I mentioned earlier, they might remove the practice manager because they've got one of them down the road. They don't need 2. And one practice manager can handle 2 practices. I think that's a moot point, but anyway, that's what they might be thinking, for example. So the big question is, how do you increase the multiple offered by the purchaser? Because if you can increase that to 5 times, then you've just increased your sale price by 20%. If you roll some of those, if you normalize some of those numbers and roll them forward, that's a massive increase. So $200,000 now becomes $1 million. So you just had a $200,000 sale price from 4 times to 5 times, from going at $800,000 or $1 million. If you think about that $200,000 in cash, what that means on an EBIT, it means that it's on a 10% EBIT, it means it's $2 million in turnover to generate that additional $200,000 in revenue. So it's just a small increase of 4 to 5 on the multiple has a tremendous impact. So to think about how do you get it from 4 to 5 is what you're saying. And to put that another way, what you're saying is that the purchaser will sit back for 5 years to get their money out instead of getting their money out in 4 years. And so then the question is, how do you do that? How do you get them to think that your sale is less risky? And there's a number of ways you can do that. And probably the best impact that you can have on this, and this kind of taps into the why as well as to why we need to watch our database, is the more accurate the information you have around your database, the more that database will be valued. And so what will happen is when they come in to do when they get into the detail, and the devil is in the detail with a sale of your practice, for example, to a corporate or anyone that knows what they're talking about, what they'll do is they'll go in and they'll say, all right, you made $200,000 profit. I'm not just going to give you $800,000, which is 4 times. I'm going to look at where that profit's come from. And what they'll do is they'll break it down and they'll have a look at your database, for example. And if you've got 3 points of sale for your database, so you've got a mobile phone, an email address, and a home address or a work address, so a physical address we can write to, you will be paid a higher multiple for that client than you will for someone where you've only got a mobile phone. And if you think about it from a purchaser's perspective, you put yourself in their shoes. If you were buying this practice and you knew that you had 3 times the opportunity to get in touch with that client and upsell to the client, because don't forget, no company's going to pay 5 times for free. The only way they're going to pay 5, 6, and I think Gary 7 times is one of the guys running around town.
Has just been floating around recently, yeah.
Yeah, they're not really paying 7. We're going to come to that, but what they're really saying to you is they're saying, "We'll pay you 7.5. The market won't bear that. I mean, IT stocks maybe, but you take that to the capital markets, to the stock exchange, and the brokers that have to underwrite a listing will just go, that's ridiculous. There's no way I'm paying 7.5." So what they're doing is they're taking a punt that actually that 7.5 won't be 7.5, it'll be back to 5, because what they can do with your database is that they can increase those sales so quickly because you've taken the risk out for them by making the clients imminently contactable. So that's one thing you can do from a strategic sale point of view is the question, when you talk about strategic sale, the question you've got to ask yourself is, what could someone do with my practice better than I'm doing with it? That's basically the little catchphrase that goes with any strategic sale. What could someone else do with my business more than I'm doing with my business? And it's almost always around their capacity to tap into your database and increase your sales when you're not doing that. Maybe it's an advertising campaign that, all of a sudden you would never advertise on television, but now because you've joined a larger corporate, they are advertising on TV and you just fall into line. Interesting to see the Green Cross's share price, I think, hit $5 today, so down from its high of 10. Don't quote me on that, but I was actually told that by somebody else, which I thought was interesting. And as this person pointed out to me, maybe that's more reflective of where the share price is at. But that just as an aside. Okay. Let's have a look at the impact that an earn-out period has, because sometimes they come in and they'll say, right, Gary, we're going to buy your practice for 7 times, but in the meantime, Gary, what we want you to do is we want you to work for $120,000 a year for the next 2 years and make sure you hit your existing sales and don't drop below. So Gary goes, okay, 7 times, that's pretty good. I'll get half of it now and I'll get half of it later. And if I don't hit my number, or the growth that I'm forecasting, or whatever I've done for the last 2 years, if I don't continue at that rate, then I won't get that. I'll get something less. And I think let's say your practice, Gary, was pulling out a couple of $100,000 a year in profit over and above salaries. What you've got to factor in is that over the next 2 years, whatever sale price they're giving you, let's say it's 7 times, so it's 1.4 million, 7 times 200,000. So it's $1.4 million. Don't forget, you've got to factor in that you could have gone and worked somewhere else for $120,000. So let's leave that off the table. if you'd sold and walked away. But they're now going to take $200,000 this year profit, $200,000 next year profit that could be in your pocket. So in actual fact, the sale price is only $1 million because there's $400,000 worth of lost opportunity earnings somewhere else. And it's a really important factor to sort of weigh up. So all of a sudden now it's not 7 times, it's 5 times, because the actual purchase price is only $1 million, because they're going to collect over the next 2 years $400,000 worth of earnings before they cut a check to you, or the balance of a check. So I just want to use that as a simple example. It's may have been a little bit hard to follow for some people. It's usually a really simple example. If they say it's 7 times, but then you've got to earn out for 2 years, and they take the profits, you don't, during that earn out period, before they've made that final payment to you. Yes, they're paying $1.4 million over the next couple of years for the practice, but they're also collecting $400,000 in profits from you. And so their real price is $1 million, so their real multiple is 5 times. And it's very important not to get caught up in the hype of it, and really, really do your numbers. I worked quite closely with a couple of accountants and a practice. I won't say where it was, and so much so that I met with the corporate. I was actually Lincoln was delivering a program to Coles, and they had to come to me at the hotel in this state, and we sat down over breakfast and went through it. I went through it with the CEO. It was very, very clear to me what they were doing. Good guys, nothing wrong with the guys, but it was just there was a little bit of smokes and mirrors. Let me just say that around what the number looked like, and by the time we had normalized some of the figures in terms of the payment timings, the lost opportunity earnings, the lost opportunity profitability, I think the purchase price went from something like 2.6 million to 1.8 million. So it was a massive normalizing effort by the accountants. That's what they're good at. And it demonstrated that they weren't paying anywhere near the multiple that they were sort of claiming to be paying. So have a think about a lot of those, just some of those things. It's not just earn out period either. There's other factors in there that apply. I can't think of any off the top of my head now, but they just pare that number back again. Okay, look, that's an hour pretty much of making sense of some of the numbers. I hope that's been helpful. I'm just going to jump out of this so that I can actually see the questions, because I can't scroll. No, there's no more questions. We still have all 24 attendees on, which is nothing short of a miracle for an hour of finance. Should we tell a joke, Gary, or something, just to sort of round it out?
Well, let's just give a moment. There's thanks. Any final questions? Anything at all on that before we call the night? Let's give it a moment. And no, I'm not going to tell a joke.
I will. I'll tell a joke. Let's see how many people drop off. I'm going to keep this joke to under 3 minutes because we're not finishing technically till 9 o'clock. I'll tell this joke. There's no more questions coming in, so I'll assume that there aren't any more questions. Maybe, I hope I haven't heard this joke. Okay. So there's a guy who's absolutely, sort of numbers related. He's desperate for work. He's got a destitute family. They're all sort of sitting at home wondering where the next meal is coming from. And this guy's walking through the street thinking, oh, I've got to get a job. I don't know what I'm going to do. He doesn't apply to the vet practice. What he does is he sees a sign in the hall that says auditions on Saturday, and he thinks to himself, auditions on Saturday, I wonder what this is. So he goes and speaks to the guys in the hall, and he says, look, come along on Saturday, it's pretty easy. Here's your script. We're expecting a big turnout, so get here early. And so he reads the script, and all he has to say is, hark, I hear the cannons roar. So it's sort of a Shakespearean theme. And he thinks, hark, I hear the cannons roar. That's it? That's all I've got to say? And he says, yep, that's it. All you got to say is that. He said, oh, this is my opening. This is going to be brilliant. I get to, this is the start of my acting career. And they make a fortune. So anyway, he goes away and he practices and practices. Hark, I hear the cannons roar. Hark, I hear the cannons roar. He practices all night, 2 days. He's just cleaning his teeth in the shower, everywhere. He can think, oh, hark, I hear that. He's got this whole thing worked out. Hark, I hear the cannons roar. He's even doing the hand actions, like he's over his ears. He's got the whole thing worked out. And he gets to the day, it's Saturday, turns up, it's a massive queue, 300 people long. He's sort of working his way through the queue and he's thinking, oh, God, so many people, but I'm really, like, I've practiced this, I'm going to be so good. Anyway, he walks, finally, it's his turn. He walks in, gets on the stage, and the guy says, are you ready to go? He says, yeah, I'm ready to go. And all of a sudden, there is this almighty boom from the back of the stage. He goes, shit, what was that? So I can't gauge from the audience as to how many people are currently falling off their chairs laughing. But I expect the sledging just to, here we go. Good on you, Steve. Thanks, mate.
Coming through.
No, it wasn't that bad, Simon. All righty. Well, that brings us to a close, unless anyone has any final questions. We've still got 24 people online, which is amazing. Thank you, everybody.
All right.
For those jet setting off to Paris later this week, have a great trip. What's that?
I was just going to say we will keep picking up on common themes that are coming through coaching calls. So where there's clearly issues for most practices, we will get together like this from time to time and have these members only webinars we can all jump on and just add a little bit more to the linking content over the course of your training.
Okay, terrific. Thanks, Gary.
Lovely. Thanks very much.
Okay, see ya.
Okay. Good night, all.
Good night.